Welcome everyone to the North America launch of the 2021 Oikocredit Impact Report. In 2020, Oikocredit investors, staff, cooperative members like Oikocredit US and Oikocredit Canada, and most importantly, borrowers and beneficiaries of Oikocredit's investments were significantly impacted by COVID-19. Oikocredit and 8 other major global investors in microfinance actually signed a memorandum of understanding in May 2020 to coordinate refinancing in a responsible manner for microfinance and small and medium enterprise financial institutions. Those 9 institutions have $15 billion US dollars under management in more than 80 emerging and frontier markets. Since then, Oikocredit has done a few key things to support their long-term partners across the world. This includes loan restructuring and grant funding to help partners adjust to a new COVID-19 reality. Today, we're here to discuss the way that impact investors like Oikocredit have and continue to have an opportunity to provide support to existing partners and to support recovery from the global health and economic changes caused by COVID-19. I'm Sara, Shoff, Chief Operating Officer for Oikocredit US. Again, welcome. Just a quick note, if you have any questions for our panelists or about Oikocredit's impact, please put them in the chat. We'll have a Q&A of about 15 minutes at the end. And now for our panel. First up is John Barry. John is currently the director of the Jobs Tunisia project. John has 3 decades of experience in implementing microenterprises in more than 40 countries. John has promoted access to finance through loans, grants, training, and technical assistance for donors and nonprofit organizations in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. He's lived and worked in Niger, Tunisia, Rwanda, and Swaziland, and has extensive writing and speaking experience and is author of numerous articles on microfinance, as well as a book on the Rwandan genocide. John speaks French and Spanish and Zarma, and he has an MA from Johns Hopkins SAIS and a BA from American University. Thank you for joining us today, John.
Thank you.
Also on our panel is Lindsay Wallace. Lindsay is a senior economist and impact measurement specialist with over 20 years of experience in economic development and financial inclusion. She is currently an independent consultant and senior associate with Limestone Analytics, where she supports clients in strategy, impact measurement, and evaluation. Previously, she was head of impact for the MasterCard Foundation, where she oversaw strategy, impact measurement, and evaluation for the foundation's over $3 billion in committed investments. She was previously deputy director of the Financial Inclusion Program, where she managed $500 million of blended finance investments. She also led an economic growth program for the UK Department of International Development in Rwanda, including programs on trade, climate change, agriculture, land tenure reform, and financial inclusion. She also has public finance experience working with the Ministries of Finance in Ontario, Rwanda, Sierra Leone, Guyana, and budget reform, expenditure, forecasting, and financial transparency. She lives in Toronto with her husband, son, and daughter. Thank you for joining us, Lindsay. And finally, I'll be passing it over to our moderator, Karen, in just a minute. Karen Tsang is a risk, governance, and operations professional with experience spanning the financial services, healthcare, government, and not-for-profit sectors. She's currently Director of Global Enterprise and Operational Risk at Manulife Financial Corporation, where she oversees Manulife's global risk management framework and risk operations, such as external financial reporting and advanced risk analytic development. Previously, Karen has worked with organizations such as the Bank of Montreal, Great West Life, and the Scarborough Hospital to development and mature their risk management and governance programs. In addition to volunteering on Oikocredit Canada's board, she's also a managing consultant for the Zambian Tennis Association, supporting the linkage of tennis and youth development in the country. She previously served as disaster management team lead with the Canadian Red Cross and board director at Asian Community Aid Service in Toronto, Canada. Karen holds a master's in science and international management from the University of Liverpool in the UK and a BA with honors in international development from York University in Canada. Karen, now over to you.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. So as Sarah mentioned, we've seen the pandemic affect the operations of Oikocredit and our partners and clients. So since 2020, we've seen modest but uneven recovery between the sectors and the countries in terms of the severity and the effects of the pandemic. So looking at our 2021 impact report, we've seen modest slowdown in some of the financial inclusion metrics in terms of the clients reached, as well as some of the key metrics that we highlighted in the report. But at the same time, we've also seen some impressive growth in the impact of our renewable energy portfolio. So for example, we're up 30% in terms of client households served, and now these households have access to clean energy. So that's from 52,000 to 68,000 clients since last year. So it points to some of the asymmetries of the impact of COVID on the work that we do and on our clients. And so while the factors in the whole ecosystem of impact investing are pretty complex and varied, we thought we would take the panel as an opportunity to examine the impact of COVID from both the investors and the client side. So we'll have a few questions for both Lindsay and John from both the investor and the client side impact. And then there'll be some time for folks on the call to type in your questions, and then Sara and I will field the questions to the panelists. So let's get started. So first question is, how has the pandemic changed investor attitudes towards social impact investing? And Lindsay and John, feel free to take it.
Happy to start, and then John, feel free to join. So first of all, big thank you to Oikocredit and everyone for organizing this webinar. I am also on the board of the Oikocredit Canada Support Association. And just to say as well, I'm also on the board of something called CAFID, which is the Canadian Forum for Impact Investment and Development. And we're actually going to be releasing a State of the Sector report in a couple of months, but have just done a big survey of Canadian impact investors who are focused on emerging and frontier markets similar to Oikocredit. And so one thing that I can say without, the report is yet to be released, but we actually found that interest in and actually assets under management for the group that we've been looking at has increased. We found a 70% increase over between 2019 and 2021. So, and as well, when we conducted our survey, we found that there was increased, about 60% of the respondents indicated that they, while they recognize the challenges that the pandemic has had, particularly for their end clients, similar to Oikocredit, it hasn't necessarily slowed down interest. And in many cases, we do see an continued increase interest in impact investing, responsible investing, and part of the recognition that we do need to focus and leverage our financial capital to help build back better globally. So I'd say it's, if anything, nothing like a pandemic to also recognize how interconnected the world is. And we've been pleasantly surprised with the continuing growth and interest in impact investing. John?
Yeah, thank you. I think, this is a really fascinating question. And I think that, so we've seen positive evolution on both the supply and the demand side. Even in the context of COVID. I think on the demand side, there's a kind of a growing, if you will, sense of, you only live once. And I think, the COVID has certainly caused many of us to reflect on our own mortality and frankly on what is our money doing. So I think that there is increasing demand for these impact investment products. And that is coupled at the same time by an increase in supply. We've seen some sustainable investments grow by more than 50 billion over the course of the year, and that's double last year's increase. So, the COVID has clearly impacted many, many aspects of the economy, but, to me, the impact investment space seems to be on a positive trajectory. It seems to be almost counter-cyclical in a way to the impact of COVID. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning is the evolution of supply in terms of the sophistication of supply, and and I think also perhaps of the sophistication of demand. And I'll point to particularly, one of the things that we didn't have when folks started talking about impact investment was the kind of indicators that IRIS Plus has developed. And for those who are unfamiliar with IRIS Plus, I think it originally meant institutional reform in the informal sector, but it's kind of whatever it meant is now it's just IRIS Plus. And they've done a really pretty phenomenal job of disaggregating impact investment measurement tools by sector, by industry, et cetera. It makes sense that you can't compare an impact investment in education to one in energy, for example, at least directly. So they've looked at a whole raft of indicators that would give us a positive sense of impact by different industries. So I think that's also a positive evolution. I remember when I stepped into this conversation about impact investment, it was a lot about investment and not so much about impact, because impact was hard and our impact still is hard. But I think one of the positive evolutions that we've seen as an industry is there are many more, the level of sophistication in terms of measuring our impact has grown significantly. So far, it kind of, you scratch your head and wonder, but it does seem counter-cyclical. COVID has hit a lot of people, but impact investment seems to be thriving.
And just as a follow-up question, have you seen differences or asymmetries in different industries, like the appetite and sophistication for impact investing in different industries? Maybe energy is more popular, or maybe research is more popular. Have you seen any differences in the course of the pandemic in these sophistication and interest levels?
Well, clearly the elephant in the room is global climate change, right? So there is definitely interest on the energy front, and there's some innovative, things that have been done at the micro level, off-grid type stuff with energy. So folks have been flirting with this for a little while, but I really think that the stage is set, and it is time. If we're going to deal with the global climate change, energy is clearly one place to start. So I think you're spot on there.
Yeah, and it makes sense in our impact report as well that the renewable energy portfolio is actually the one portfolio where we've seen impressive growth compared to the other two portfolios. So that makes sense. And then relating to that question is the second question. So have you seen any specific new opportunities for impact investors, which you kind of alluded to already, related to COVID recovery, but otherwise any other new sectors or strategies that you're seeing investors are making or are interested in?
Yeah, I'll kick that one off. Certainly completely agree with John that green energy and climate change is a really important, increasingly important sector of focus. And that also came out in the survey that I mentioned. We have seen some increased interest, at least amongst Canadian impact investors, in the health sector. Obviously with COVID, that's not too surprising. A couple other areas that I think are of interest, and we have seen an expansion, is certainly in this financial inclusion space. One of the things that we did see uniquely in this pandemic was a massive increase in digitization of the financial sector, and that being leveraged by governments to get digital payments out. I mean, we went from, I think it was about 1 billion people being having access to digital financial services to that almost doubling in the course of a year, which for somebody that's been working in financial inclusion has been an incredible growth pattern. And actually a lot of that digital finance network very much supports the off-grid energy with pay-as-you-go solar and so on. So certainly, from where I sit, we've seen a lot of expansion in digitization of financial services. And that's also something that Oikocredit is increasingly focusing on. Finally, I think one key theme that's come out with the pandemic really has to do with the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women, and a recognition that it's really affected especially poor women's livelihoods, with the lockdowns and so on. And so I think a realization that there's a need to continue to focus and expand on gender lens investing. And certainly in the survey that we did of Canadian impact investors, it's upward of 80+% of folks are really interested in focusing on a gender lens and making sure that impact investments are directed towards women. Thanks.
Great. And Lindsay, I would agree 100% about digital finance. And I would also argue, to your latter point, that digital finance can have a transformative effect on financial inclusion. I'll speak a little bit from the context of the Tunisian project, which I'm directing, but our focus there is women, youth, and rural borrowers, underserved populations, and digital finance is a great tool for kind of breaking. You're leapfrogging basically the technological limitations of having to kind of, it's what I kind of jokingly call white glove banking, where my grandmother used to go into the bank with her white gloves on and write a check, and she knew the name of the teller, and that kind of personal relationship banking. Well, in the time of COVID, that doesn't exist anymore in the same way. And so folks have shifted. And one of the things that's been interesting for me in watching this project happen in Tunisia is, the whole concept of an ATM and a virtual account, a digital account is so ingrained just in our consciousness. It's hard to get to the point where you really understand that, well, no, this could be something new and maybe a little daunting for rural clients or women clients. And so, helping provide the training and support, for them to be able to adapt these digital tools is important. Another thing that we've seen kind of from the ground, and we've seen some pretty clever innovations, is this kind of hybrid system where you've got digital, how do you do digital finance for somebody who has what they call a feature phone, right? Who does not have a smartphone, right? So one of the things they've been doing in Tunisia is working through the post office, because there's a post office in every little village, right? And if the post office has an ATM, you can set up your account. So folks are being clever, I think, about how to handle digital finance. It's not a magic bullet. It needs to be implemented in a culturally sensitive context. And I think we need to understand there could be resistance to digitalization as well. Another trend that I've been seeing in Tunisia, and we've been working with the Postal Savings Bank there on developing an impact measurement and monitoring and measurement and management system, IMM, and helping them develop a strategy and then some tools. And we've made tremendous strides with them. But then one of the challenges that we found on the ground is building the capacity for impact measurement and monitoring at the grassroots level, because you can work with these larger national level institutions to develop their capacity. But if the folks that they're invested in and the clients of these organizations are not able to produce those data, then you've got a challenge. So I think digital finance, I think an increased interest in impact measurement. Another tool that I've seen, it's been around for a little while, but I think that we're seeing more and more how that can be useful in combining it with digitalization is value chain finance. Things like warehouse receipts, where you really are working to kind of provide digital solutions all up and down the value chain. So digital finance can be a really cool tool, but I think we need to think about it also as to how it applies on the ground, right? And to really get down to the point where we're providing the digital services that people want and can use in a culturally sensitive way.
Great, thanks. So both Lindsay and John, I think you've highlighted some of the priorities and interests that the investors had, like from gender issues to digitization and payments. So it sounds like basically would it be correct to say that the priorities or the interests of some of the investors are bringing the inflow and then also advancing the development of these, let's say, these two particular areas? How can you comment a little bit on like the actual positive differences that you've seen in terms of the impact on women's or gender issues, as well as the digitization and payments as a result of the increase in interest of impact investing in these two areas?
Sure, I'm happy to maybe touch on the first one, and I've been doing some work actually for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, specifically related to digital finance. So it's very much front of mind for me at the moment, and in particular, um, what we've seen is this rapid expansion of digital payments, particularly transferring from government to small businesses. And what we see is that particularly when the funds go directly into individuals' accounts, particularly women's accounts, and if they are able to control those accounts, we see all kinds of benefits in terms of women's economic empowerment. It changes some of the intra-household power dynamics. They're able to save more. They're able to, we see benefits in terms of their expenditure on education and on health services. So being able to basically digitize the resources and direct them to the head of the house, or to the women in the household, we know have a lot of broader impacts. There's also a local market effect, though, as well, that comes from this, being able to transfer funds, and don't forget, these emergency relief programs, mostly directed towards the poor, but under COVID, we saw a wider expansion. In some cases, particularly because of the fact that, in the early days of the pandemic, we weren't quite sure what were some of the vectors of transmission. In Rwanda, in particular, they shifted away from cash. So in order to use cash, any merchant had to sanitize it. And so we saw everything go digital overnight. And what you can do with digital finance as opposed to cash finance, if you've got the right environment, and there's a whole bunch of factors that need to be in place in order for this to all work well, but you're able to save in a way that you aren't able to if you're doing what John called, the white glove banking, having to go, and maybe nobody goes to the bank and puts $1 in every single day. It's just not efficient. But on a mobile wallet, you can do that. So the flexibility that's afforded by the digital transfers, as well as the ability to keep those funds digital, manage them, cash them out when you need to through a robust agent network. There is a fair bit of research that does show some of the benefits in terms of livelihoods, well-being, social norm shift, and all kinds of broader indications. Why don't I pause there and let John jump in? Because I think there's a couple of questions in the chat that might be helpful to touch on as well.
Yeah. So I think that, to me, obviously there are challenges in going digital, but I firmly believe that once we've gone digital, we're not going back. Right. I mean, this is forward progress. Right. But I do think that digital, we can't look at that as a monolithic thing, and we can't just assume that because it's digital, it's good. Right. We need to be aware that for example, the issue of smartphones versus, I don't call them dumb phones, feature phones, right? Stuff that's not connected to the internet in the same way. Those are the kind of things that we need to take into consideration as we're promoting digital finance. Also, if there's a cell phone in the house, the woman might not have access to it. So, these kind of micro level things are important, when we're looking for a macro level, to reach a macro level goal of promoting digitalization, right? So a lot of this comes into kind of, how you design your products, how you incorporate digitalization, what sort of scaffolding do you build around the digitalization process? We cannot assume that if we build it, they will come, right? We need to make sure that they have, the willingness and the capacity to come. One thing that I thought was fairly clever that we did with some partners at Advance and Baobab in Tunisia was we had a $3 million grant program to promote resilience among small businesses, small and micro businesses in Tunisia. And they could apply, it was a blended finance program, so that they could apply for a grant, which was funded by USAID, and then was matched or leveraged by capital from these microfinance lending organizations. But one of the organizations, Advance, was really, I thought, pretty clever, where they said, look, we've got a grant, and these grant sizes were averaging $200 to $300. We've got a grant for you. If you want the grant, you got to sign up for a digital card. So here's $200 free, but you got to sign up for the digital card. And then they built in some scaffolding in terms of training, and then also a call center for folks who didn't have access, to the internet. So we've got to think holistically, and we've got to think from the client's perspective, right, of what digitalization is going to mean. And that, I think largely can be positive, but if you're not taking that context into consideration, it can also be negative, or you just get no impact, you get no uptake, right? So I want to put in another plug here, just in terms of the general concept of impact monitoring and measurement management, and that is who bears the cost, right? Because this is a key thing. It's like we can't talk about digital in the global sense of digital is always good, and we can't talk about impact measurement in the sense of impact measurement is always good, because somebody's got to count the beans, right? Somebody has got to figure out what sort of impact we're having. We had a big challenge in Tunisia, for example, because we have 3 key indicators of social impact: youth, women, and rural borrowers. And the way that we were asking for impact data was slightly different, not very much different, but slightly different from the way that our partners were normally in their standard operating procedures capturing data. So they had to end up doing it all manually, which was a huge time sink. So, as we think about digitalization, as we think about impact monitoring management, we got to also think about the real world impact this has both on our clients and on our partners.
Yeah,
Agreed.
Great, thanks. And I see in the Q&A, we do have a question on the impact assessment, which we can probably get to. Sorry, Lindsay, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, this might be a good point to jump back to Chad's question on the disproportionate impact on women, and whether it prevents a barrier or an opportunity for impact investing. What we've seen in the pandemic is that certainly women-led businesses have been disproportionately hurt. A lot of one of the outstanding things of the Oikocredit report is that 87% of the clients this year are women, of the financial inclusion clients. This is a real, microfinance to women businesses. That's a real positive gender story. But they've been hurt. There's still most places here as well, the social norms are such that women still take on a disproportionate amount of childcare responsibilities, and with the closing of schools, which we saw, across the world, that had an impact on women's businesses. The lockdowns had a significant impact on women's businesses. This is not to say men weren't affected, but just disproportionately, when you break it down, particularly in emerging markets, it was a much harder effect on women. And I think the statistics are the same for here in North America. So much of it relates to schools being open and effective childcare systems being in place. Does it present a barrier or an opportunity for impact investing? I think it's an opportunity, certainly in the long run. I think we're here in North America, we're in a little bit of a bubble where, people are getting vaccinated, but the global vaccination rate, especially in some of the places that Oikocredit works, is still abysmally low, 2%. I think it's maybe 10% in India. It's, there's so much more to do to actually get to the other side of the pandemic. So, I think certainly in the short run, there are opportunities for investment, continuing to have a gender lens. I think in the longer run, direct investment into women's businesses, certainly, looking at childcare related investments, there's opportunities that can come from these challenges. But I think just right now and where we are, there's a lot more we need to get through to kind of get to the other side.
Mm-hmm. So this kind of brings us to the next question. And Lindsay, you mentioned that you've seen the needs of a lot of our women clients change over the course of the pandemic. So the question is, what kind of changes have you seen in the needs of the borrowers and entrepreneurs because of COVID? So aside from childcare, maybe other needs or the general population at large of our clients?
I think, in the immediate needs were just cash to kind of keep people, cash or digitally transferred finance to kind of keep going, and just to kind of, much like we saw in the emergency responses here in North America. I think one thing that we did see as well is that the agricultural sector was not as disrupted as I think people were fearing, which is a good thing, because there could have been all kinds of further spillover. I mean, I know we're having general supply chain challenges, but I remember in the earlier days of the pandemic, there was a real concern. And of course, we know that increasingly, particularly in Africa, farmers are female farmers. What we saw the need was just kind of continued support. Again, I think right now we need to collectively do all we can to make sure that everybody is vaccinated, so we can start to return to a little bit back to normal. Just anecdotally as well, I've been working on an evaluation of a girls' education project in Zimbabwe. And over the course, it took place over the course of the pandemic and several years beforehand. We saw a significant increase in teenage pregnancy, particularly with the schools shut down. We saw, some shifts in learning just because of the schools shut down. So while maybe, these are not yet clients, but we're seeing a lot of disruptions in, who would be clients in the future. So I think, folks need support in terms of just plain old financial support. We need to get the vaccines rolled out, and, a lot of concerns about, on the macro fiscal side, debt levels and all that, but don't need to go into that here. Continued support to the ag sector to make sure that people are still able to eat. And then interestingly, we did a survey of CAFID members last year as to what has been the main impact of the pandemic. And we did see that, a lot of impact investors and their clients or small businesses, they were innovative and they pivoted. A lot of them pivoted to produce PPE or address some of the immediate needs in the environment. So yeah, but I think if I had to place my money somewhere, vaccines for everybody. That's probably the closest thing, the fastest way to kind of begin to build back better.
No, I would agree. It's interesting, the assumptions that we walk into a conversation with our partners, based on our experience of COVID and talking to them about their experience with COVID. And I was just running a training program this week on agricultural risk management with a bunch of financial institutions, banks, and MFIs in Nigeria. And we had a kind of an open conversation, discussion questions. Basically the elephant in the living room is COVID. How has that impacted your risk management? I was really impressed with how creative they were, and how several of them mentioned COVID as not just a problem, but an opportunity. One of the things that we talked about, which is key in managing agricultural risk, is client visits, right? And you can't do client visits in the same way. So what this has created is an opportunity for them to do virtual outreach. Which has actually saved them money. It's been a positive evolution in that sense. So, out of a negative thing, they've made a positive thing. And interestingly, when we talked about kind of what was the impact of COVID, and this is in the Nigerian context, but I think it's indicative, they were more concerned about the security situation than about COVID, because of, all the problems that are going on in northern Nigeria, and that's just a deal breaker. You can't visit a farm if you're worried that your loan officer might get kidnapped, right? So the other thing that was a little bit surprising to me, and again, this is kind of you got to check your own assumptions when you walk into a conversation. I said, well, great to hear all these different tools and techniques that you're using. And frankly, they seem to have mastered the increase. There was definitely a bump in portfolio at risk in the early part of the pandemic. But that if you look at the kind of wholesale figures on Africa, there was a big bump, and folks have seemed to have gotten control over it. So but I was thinking, well, okay, we're looking hopefully at the short side of this, and we'll get some vaccines, and we'll get. But how are you guys handling this psychologically? Because frankly, here from Seattle, there've been some pretty dark days through this COVID thing, and there was psychologically, it's like, oh no, we're just doing business. So yeah, they in many ways, I think the Nigerians are more resilient than the Americans are in many ways, and maybe less divided as a society about this whole COVID thing. So it is important to check your assumptions about COVID, based on your own experience and how you've been dealing with it. But I've just been surprised at their resilience and their ability to turn a crisis into an opportunity.
Mm-hmm. So Lindsay and John, you both mentioned some pivoting in some of the operations of our clients. So from shifting to virtual outreach and field visits, or maybe shifting the methods of production or the things that are being produced. So maybe some needs in capacity development and infrastructure support to pivot manufacturing or capacity. So we have another question here, and I think we've touched on this already a little bit. It's about, again, an impact measurement, but specifically in response to the needs of our clients. So have there been any changes in how we have been measuring impact, specifically relating to COVID changes and how we deliver support to our clients?
Sorry. I'm not sure there's been too many changes in how we measure. There's probably a few other things that we want to measure. But just, one thing to say, both, it's in the Oikocredit impact report, but also came out very clearly in some of the research that we've done with CAFID, is just, the ubiquitousness of the SDGs and the Sustainable Development Goals is kind of a common frame that pretty much everybody is using. And then under that, there's a whole variety of other measurement systems, tools, and approaches that can then be rolled up. But I'm old enough to remember when we had the Millennium Development Goals that predated the SDGs, and the idea that every big corporation would be putting out a Millennium Development Goal report is, we're just at such a different place now than we were. Huge, lots of complexities with the SDGs, how to measure and so on. But I think we're at least agreeing that these are the collective goals. I think what we do know as well is one of the impacts of COVID is we've been seeing for goal number 1, which is to reduce poverty. Up until COVID, we've been seeing a very strong and healthy trend, certainly not universal, but in aggregate. And that's shifted back. So we're seeing increases in poverty. So it's not necessarily the approach to measurement. It's just we've got further to go to actually reach the goal. I'm happy to touch on, Atul had a question on impact measurement, but John, I don't know if you want to jump in first or
I
reflections.
Think, I think this is a very interesting point, but I think that what this does in my mind is it gets to the heart of that continuum, right, that exists at the foundation of impact investment, which is impact versus income, right? And you need to look at it. It's almost kind of like a parallax view. You look at it from different perspectives, right? And the impact that donors have on the perspective that donors have on impact investment is going to be focused on that impact side, right? Whereas the focus of the small businesses that are generating the jobs, that are employing women, that are having that social impact, right? I mean, their focus is going to be more on income, right? And kind of, the impact part of it. Yeah, I mean, you can have that conversation, but what you get sometimes as pushback is kind of what's in it for me. I'm interested in my bottom line. Fine, I'm employing women. We're doing all these great things. We've got micro solar here, but but why do I need to count that? So I think we do need to keep in mind that the folks at the grassroots level, at the most basic level, right, that the folks who are running these small businesses are not as concerned with the impact side of it as we are, right, at a higher level. So I think there's that dynamic, that plays out. And to me, a well-designed impact monitoring system is going to take that into account. Is going to take the fact that, these guys are not, by their nature, they wouldn't be collecting these data, right? So the extent to which we can calibrate the information that we ask for to the information that they're already generating makes life easier for everybody, and gets back to this issue of the cost of impact monitoring, right? Because, in a way that drives our model, but somebody pays for it, right? And if it's not us, it's them, right? And to me, that's where we really need to check our assumptions, is if we're forcing these small businesses to take on extra costs to produce data that we want for us, what's in it for them? So I think that we've proven that you can have both, right? You can have impact and investment. I mean, and they're not mutually exclusive, but who pays for it at the end of the day? That's one of the questions we need to walk in asking, because it's hard to answer. It's hard to kind of inject that in at the end.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think certainly in my experience with an agriculture finance challenge fund, it's that process of engaging with the business and understanding, well, what is it that you want to find out? What do you currently collect? And coming up with a system that works for both. It takes longer. But often I found some businesses are increasingly being interested in understanding what their impact is. Generally the slightly larger ones, maybe less so the smaller ones. And so it's got to be a dialogue. Yeah. And just to respond to Tul's first question, I'd say the question is, could you expand on how impact assessment is different when philanthropic capital is deployed versus social impact capital? These are the same conversations with development aid. Just to say, I think it's all very similar. It's just looking at it through slightly different lenses. And to John's point, in the impact capital, you obviously want to understand what the financial return is as well as the overall impact. But in terms of quantifying, measuring, thinking through impact, one of my observations is that I think the development sector, because it's been doing it for a lot long, actually has a lot to teach the impact investment sector in terms of the level of sophistication, understanding, how do you actually measure impact with, the kind of really robust and rigorous ways and so on. So I think there's more to be done for kind of cross-learning between the two areas, but you're right, they're very, very similar.
John, I want to circle back on something that you mentioned around checking our assumptions and some of the opposite of widening. I'm losing a word for it, but the narrowing gap between perhaps differences in priorities between the investors and the clients, but the need to check our assumptions and when we look at impact investing. And Diana asked a question that's relating to this. It's about the vaccine hesitancy in a lot of the countries where Oikocredit works. And Lindsay, you mentioned, getting the vaccines pushed out there as a priority, getting return to normal. But in cases where there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy, how effective would a strategy of vaccine pushing be? And because especially if we're going to be grappling in countries where vaccine hesitancy is high, how does that impact the investment strategy of investors or Oikocredit or other organizations that you're familiar with?
I think it's hard enough to get paid back. I don't know about getting paid back and getting people to take vaccines at the same time. I applaud, all of the folks who are working to get those vaccines out. I know how hard it is, particularly in the case of resistance. But from our point of view, I look at what is a manageable interest, right? And I just don't see how working with a microfinance institution to push vaccines is going to improve the dialogue that they have with their clients. I think it's risks getting us off base. And I'm a bit of a dinosaur on this, but I have seen successful methodologies that get weighed down with other ideas. Village savings and loans, which are great, like non-institutional approach to lending based on money gathered in the village, right? Well, it's working so well, let's add a healthcare component to that. Well, that you've automatically added an institutional component to it. You need staff to do that. You need vehicles to get staff out there. And that just weighs down the methodology to the point that it's no longer the same thing. So I don't know. And you're asking me, so you get a full John on this one, but I think that our partners in the microfinance business have enough challenges putting the vaccines, trying to promote vaccines on top of them seems to me to be maybe a bridge too far. But I'm throwing that out as an opinion.
So I would agree, and I guess when I suggested that we need to get vaccines out, it wasn't meant to imply that Oikocredit should be doing that. I mean, it's the ministries of health. It's, certainly also working with the local organizations like the African CDC. My former place that I used to work at, the MasterCard Foundation, they donated $1 billion to the African CDC to help with vaccine distribution. I think there's a lot that we as a kind of collective, global set of people who are concerned can do. Vaccine hesitancy changes as well. It's going to to evolve over time. But I think the only way, I just want to get through the end of this pandemic. I'm sure I'm not alone in that.
Oh yeah.
And certainly, and just to say, here in Ontario, we're at 85% one dose, and I think almost 80% two doses for adults. We're trying to close that gap, and you're starting to see we really are starting to return to normal, and we're not having that much. It's not all perfect, but science, vaccines work. We've had decades of research on it. So that being said, I don't think it's not that Oikocredit, and I completely agree with John, let's not add this onto what they're doing, but certainly, getting through this in a way, it will be so much, it'll make it a lot easier for them to continue to grow and support, and the economies to grow and poverty reduce and all those good things that we want to have.
I think we're in agreement 100%. I mean, I think, we really need to look at COVID not just as a pandemic and a medical issue, but also as a social and economic issue. And I think working in partnership with our, fellow travelers in public health, 100%. But when I think about the traditional tools and techniques of microfinance, right, they're not necessarily well adapted to, a COVID response. For example, what would you do if you had a situation with a village group that wasn't working? Well, you'd have a group meeting. Well, in this context, that could end up being a super spreader event, right? So some of the traditional tools and techniques that we use in microfinance are just not appropriate for, for a COVID response. That said, look, there are public health centers that we can work with. There's all sorts of collaboration. I mean, the economic impact of COVID has been huge, right? And so I do think that what we do have, that it can be an advantage for our friends in the public health sector, is this institutional structures that reach down to the village level, and can we find creative ways for our microfinance partners to work with public health partners that don't take them off message in terms of the dynamic that they have with their borrowers, their clients. You trust me, I give you money. I trust you, you pay me back. How do you work with public health people to build on that relationship rather than distract from it?
100% agree. Just one other comment, kind of building on what we said before. With this rapid shift to digitally distributed finance and a robust kind of particularly rural financial infrastructure that comes from it, so cash in, cash out points and interoperability, choice, all these other components, if and when either the next pandemic or climate change risk or flood or there's some kind of emergency response required, if the right investments are put in place now, we know that people will be able to respond. And so people will be able to get the money that they need, and through their local microfinance institutions, it'll help to keep those local economies going. In India in particular, and I think Togo is another example, they were able to get money out to their population within 10 days of the pandemic being declared. I think in many places they're still sending out physical checks in, North America and Europe. So, we've learned a lot about how to really actually be able to address and manage an emergency response. And, particularly with climate change, unfortunately, this isn't probably going to be the last thing that we see. So, taking stock and continuing to make those investments.
Yeah, so it sounds like in response to Diana's question around how does a long COVID impact the investment strategies, it sounds like we've already touched on a few of these things, the trends that we're noticing. And so it's continuing investment in some of the institutional structures, in digitization, in the ability to be able to virtually outreach to large numbers of people, supporting and working with public health, and continue digital distribution of information as well as finance.
Yeah.
I think we have time for just one quick question. It might be the last question. So pivoting a little bit. So are you seeing any new capital sources that can make a difference in COVID recovery?
I wouldn't say I'm seeing new sources. I think what we're seeing is maybe a renewed interest again in blended finance, and how to really leverage the philanthropic and grant capital to increase the overall pool of resources available for the build back. Blended finance has been around for a while. Certainly, I think it was about 60% of the respondents in our survey engage in blended finance. Oikocredit does as well. So it's really thinking through, we all know that there's going to continue to need to be, grant resources, aid resources, philanthropic resources. How do we make them do more for their, get more bang for the buck, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, I think that there has been some strong growth in the amount of money in the impact investment field, but I would certainly agree on the issue of leverage, because I do think that's part of the conversation that is fairly innovative. That said, nothing is really innovative. We used to call it a grant, right? Now we call it leverage, right? So blended finance, right? What is the difference between, the new school blended finance and the old school grants? I do think there's a difference in the level of intentionality, and in that level of interaction with the private sector and the public sector. So I do think there are two things. One is there is more private sector money that's chasing impact investments right now. And then I think there's also an increasing intentionality on the side of public sector actors of trying to leverage that private sector capital. So I think it's actually a positive dynamic. We've got more money, and we're being a little bit more sophisticated and a little bit more intentional as to how we use that money. And this grant program I was mentioning in Tunisia is a great example of it. 10 years ago, we would have just called it a grant program. Right. But we walked into this one and we're like, no, this is blended finance. And we're walking in with the intention of leveraging capital. And we leveraged 12-1 US government money. So, we had with two different grants, $3 million ended up being $12 million. Right. So, it was pretty significant. And I do think that's a positive development. I don't want to overstate it. There are a lot of folks who just think that it's all about numbers and technical solutions, and that's going to solve the problem. But I do think working together with the public sector and the private sector, and then the increased interest in the private sector in impact investment, are all positive developments.
Yeah, I agree. And just to add one other thing, what we don't see perhaps enough of it here in North America is the, investments in emerging and frontier markets by pension funds, and by the kind of the big investors. Certainly there's a lot of examples in Europe, places that Oikocredit also has a number of other support associations. So, the Danish pension funds are doing impact investing. A lot of Dutch organizations and pensions are involved. So I think there's more that we need to do. And, I think maybe, particularly in Canada, we're very risk averse and cautious, and maybe need to start pushing the envelope a little bit, take a little more risk. But there's a lot I think we can learn from other jurisdictions who also have the same, kind of barriers in terms of, fiduciary duty and public reporting requirements and all those usual things that people say are a barrier to impact investing in emerging markets. So there's lots we can learn.
Great. So yeah, hopefully maybe Canada, Oikocredit Canada can learn from the US. And the next time we gather together, talk about our impact, we'll have some improvements in our story around the appetite for frontier markets. Okay, so we're pretty much at time. I want to hand it back to Sara to close off the session.
Thank you all for joining us today. This webinar was made possible by generous donations from our stakeholders, people like you. To learn more about Oikocredit here in North America, you can check out Oikocredit US at oikocreditus.org and Oikocredit Canada at oikocredit.ca. Stakeholders in the US can actually participate in a recoverable grant program now. So if you're interested, there's more information on the Oikocredit US website. On behalf of Oikocredit US and Oikocredit Canada, thank you so much for joining us today and look forward to seeing you all soon.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks, John.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Lindsay. Bye.